You know, I really enjoy watching your YouTube programs.
Thank you.
That is a delight for me. And not only that, when I see programs that I know about the history of them, that is just incredible. I really get excited. You know, when I was 4 years old, I said a naughty word because my mom, she caught me climbing up this tree. She'd forbid me from climbing. I'd loaded my pockets full of little tiny pebbles, and I was going to climb up the tree, crawl out on a branch right above the sidewalk, and I was going to drop little pebbles on people's heads as they walked underneath that branch. And I had just gotten to the branch, and I was ready to crawl out on it, and I couldn't wait. And my mother came out on the porch, and she was calling for me and kind of looking, and then she saw me up in the tree, and she, "Oh, Davy, you get down out of that tree. You get out of that tree right this instant." Well, that made me mad. It really did. I was having all of my fun taken away from me all of a sudden. And she told me to get down out of that tree. And it made me so mad because I didn't know how to get down. And I said a naughty word. You know, it's the same word I'd heard my dad use. And it was always an appropriate moment when he said that word. And so when I said that word, my mother grabbed her chest and she fainted right on the porch. Well, I had seen my mother faint before, and it was usually some awful thing that had happened. And I didn't know how to get down out of that tree, and I guess I was probably, at least 8 feet up, you know, maybe a little bit higher. And I just jumped out of that tree, and I landed on the ground, and that's the first I ever felt my ankle sting so bad, is when I jumped out of that tree. And I ran to my mom going, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy." And my dad happened to be home at the time, and he was in the house, and he heard me, and it sounded like I was in distress. So he came out, and he saw my mom laying there on the porch, and he goes, oh dear, what can the matter be? What can the matter be?" And I had just learned that song, and I started singing, "Oh dear, what can the matter be?" I was 4 years old. And my mom woke up. He was fanning her face with his hand, you know, and holding her in his arm. And he, Clara, what's the matter? What's the matter? And she woke up, and she stuck her finger right in his nose, and she said, you are teaching your sweet little boy to say naughty words." And it was constantly poking him on the nose. And he says, "You need to be punished." Well, you know what that punishment was? I had to be punished too, because I said the naughty word. They didn't make me stand in a corner. She didn't make my dad paddle my bottom. She says, "You're taking Davy to the mine with you." That was the best punishment a little boy could ever have, because Dad had a mine down in Spring Lake, just up in the Spring Lake foothills, and I couldn't wait to get to that mine. She got me all dressed up nice and warm and kissed me goodbye, and I jumped in Dad's Jeep, and we drove all the way down to Spring Lake and pulled up in front of this little tiny cabin. Well, my dad had told me that he had 2 kings that were living down at his property, and that he was going to build them a castle. Well, I saw the castle, and it was a 1-room shack, and the 2 kings, I found out that was just their last name. And I had been having these visions of gaining their confidence and becoming one of their valiant knights. And here I was meeting Esther King. She was so big, she hardly could get out of the front door of that cabin. And then Emmett, he was just the opposite. He was so skinny, his knees would kind of wobble when he walked. And she came up, and I noticed she didn't have any teeth. And she smiled at me with no teeth, and I was scared to death. And I reached and grabbed my daddy's arm and I was, Daddy, Daddy. And he told me that I shouldn't be afraid and introduced me to Esther and Emmett King. And I'll tell you, Esther King was the sweetest woman, but she really had no education. She was just flat out dumb. And just to give you, I think you heard my brother Neil when you interviewed him, her husband Emmett left her and went to LA. And my dad had to pick him up and bring him back up, and they moved him up to Salt Lake. They were working for him. She was the camp cook, and Emmett was kind of a hand around the mine, I guess more of a watchman than anything. But I really had an enjoyable time getting to know Esther King. And one day I was out looking for little baby dinosaurs. That's what she called them. They were lizards. And I was walking along, headed kind of up the road that goes up to the Syndicate mine, and I saw this great big black snake. It was the biggest snake I ever saw. Its head went into the brush on one side of the road, and its tail went into the brush on the other side of the road, and I didn't know where its head was. And so I knew the only way for me to get back to the cabin was to get up enough nerve to jump over that snake and hightail it down to the cabin, which is exactly what I did. I ran in the cabin, and Esther's, "What's the matter, Davy? What's the matter?" And I says, "There's a big snake, Esther, and it was gonna eat me." And she says, "Well, we can't have snakes eating our little boys, can we?" And she grabbed up an axe, and she popped out that door and walked down the steps and headed out to where I told her the snake was. Well, Esther didn't have glasses, and she really needed them. And she took that axe and came down on that snake, and it went. She cut the farmer's water line in half. Boy, that made my dad mad. And another instance was Esther, she didn't have any teeth, and so her lower jaw was clear up under her nose. And she was always putting her lower lip over her right nostril. And I thought that was funny. After that, when I got to reading the funnies, it was like Mammy Yoakum in Little Abner. But anyway, I saw this big buck, and she was talking to me, and when she was talking, her nose was leaking, and she was stirring pancake batter in this big bowl. And I just realized at that moment why she kept her lower lip over her nose. She had allergies, and her nose was dripping and leaking and dripping off of her chin into the pancake batter. And I was like, yeah! And I ran over to my dad, and he had a couple of miners around him, and I was going to tell him that Esther's nose was leaking in the pancake batter. And he says, "Davy, go away. Can't you see we're having a meeting? Go away, Davy." And it made me mad. And so I picked up a rock, and I was going to go throw that rock at the big red rooster that would chase around and peck me on the bottom. And when I walked around the chicken coop, there was this great big deer there. And I looked at that big buck. It just had horns everywhere. And I said, "You better look out, Mr. Deer, because I'm mad and I've got a rock and I'm going to hit you." And I threw that rock and hit that deer right in the flank. And it jumped straight up in the air, spun around, landed facing me, dropped its head, and started pawing with its front hooves. Well, I watched Popeye cartoons, and I knew what that meant, so I turned around and hightailed it in the cabin, and Esther was in there getting the pancake batter ready, and she says, "What's the matter now, Davy?" And I said, "There's a great big deer out there, Esther, and it's gonna stick me, it's gonna stick me." And she said, "Well, we can't have these big deer sticking our little boys, can we?" And she grabs up my dad's 8mm Mauser out of the corner of the cabin, cocks a shell into it and pops out the door, and next thing I know, there's this great big bang. Scared me so bad I hid in the bed, pulled the covers over my head, and went to sleep. Well, I had been asleep for who knows how long, but when I woke up, I looked out the window to make sure that deer wasn't out there, and I saw Emmett and Esther and Eddie Sutton, the miner's helper, and I saw my dad, and they were sitting at a picnic table having pancakes. So I walked down the steps and I walked out towards them, and I saw this great big deer hide stretched out on the chicken coop with a set of antlers so big on the ground right underneath it. And I didn't know what they were. And I walked up and I said, "Esther, what's that?" And I pointed to the big fur, the big rug that was up there. And she says, "Why, Davy, when you threw that rock at that deer, you plumb scared that deer right out of its hide." And Emmett, he goes, "Yeah, and he runned off and left his antlers too." Well, I was the hero of the hour. And to get the attention off of me, and my dad wanted me to come sit down and have pancakes. And he says, "Esther, I don't know what it is about these here pancakes, but these are the most delicious, sweetest pancakes I have ever eaten. What is your secret?" Well, I know what Esther's secret is. And Esther looked and said, "What's my secret, Davy?" And I said, "Esther's nose was leaking in the pancake batter." Well, you never saw mouths stop chewing so fast in your life. And every one of them was going, "Well, I guess I better get back to work now." And none of their mouths were moving. And they got up from the table, and I could hear them spitting out those pancakes 10, 15 feet away. And Esther, it hurt her feelings, and she ran back in the cabin. She was just crying. And Daddy says, "Davy, you hurt Esther's feelings by giving away her secret recipe. And you need to go to Esther and apologize." And I wasn't quite sure what apologizing was, but my dad told me that I needed to tell her I was sorry. Well, I went up to Esther in the cabin and I said, "Esther, I'm sorry I gave away your secret recipe." And she just grabbed a hold of me. I wasn't sure she was mad at me or not. And she picked me up and just hugged me so tight. It was like the stars were coming out, you know. And she says, "Davy, nobody is going to eat my pancakes from now on. I guess we're just going to have waffles." And that's just some of my stories about being a mine camp boy. And I really enjoyed it down at the mine. I was the luckiest little kid in the world because I had an entire mountain that I could play on. All the lizards I could catch, and Dad told me not to get bit by rattlesnakes. And Esther, she warned me, she says, "If you ever see a lizard without any legs, that's probably a snake. And if it rattles at you, that means it's a rattlesnake. And if it's a rattlesnake, it's probably going to bite you and you're going to die." And so, Esther, so I never went around rattlesnakes after that. But, she was fun. She'd tell me how to catch those little dinosaurs. And Emmett, he gave me a salt shaker and he told me I had to sprinkle salt on its tail. And I did. And the first one I sprinkled salt on its tail, it didn't run away. And so I just reached down real quick and I grabbed it by the tail and I pulled on its tail and it pulled on its tail and its tail pulled off in my fingers and it was going squiggly wiggly. And I was like, "Ah!" And I ran inside the cabin, and once again, now what's wrong now, Davy? You know, and I had that tail, and I had been out there, and she thought that was a snake, and it scared her so bad. That reminds me of another story. She was in the cabin, she was cooking up a meal, and there was a rattlesnake under the cabin, and we could hear it rattling under the cabin, and she grabbed that rifle of my dad's and started blowing the holes in the floor of the cabin, trying to shoot that rattlesnake she couldn't see. So I really enjoyed my time down at the mine, and my dad knew it. And so he told me that he was going to train me to be a miner's helper. And he gave me the responsibility of picking up rocks off of the mine rails. Now, they were working up at the Syndicate mine at the time. I don't really know what drift they were running. One of those goes back in for over a mile.
Really?
And I could send you a picture of the survey of that mine. But my job was to make sure that the ore car, when they pushed it out, it didn't hit any rocks. And my dad paid me 10 cents a day and kept me up there for a week at a time.
What year was that?
Oh, 54. Yeah, 54, 55. And boy, 10 cents a day, that's like 50 cents a week. And I could buy a lot of gum and sugar daddies and stuff like that with that 10 cents a day. And I just, every time I had an opportunity to work with my dad, I did. And he was the best partner that I ever had. He was always patient with me. About the maddest he ever got at me was when I wanted to split this log with his axe, and it was, he had just put a new handle on it. And so he taught me what to do and how to swing that axe. And I was a lot older. I was probably 8 years old by this time. And I missed the log and I hit the axe handle on that log and it snapped that axe head off of the handle. And oh, my dad was mad at me. And about the only thing my dad ever said as far as his vocabulary was, "Damn fool." About as bad as I could feel, you know, to be called a damn fool. But I worked in those mines. Eventually, I became the president of several of the corporations.
Really?
And we had no money. I mean, a mine is a hole in the ground you pour money into. And Dad, he finally, in his 80s, he lived till he was 85, and at 85, he was still working in the mines in Yellow Rock Canyon, which you can see the mine dump from down there in South Spring Lake. And we've had people come up, they have metal detectors now, you know, and they can really kind of zero in on where the valuable metals are. And my dad, he had dowsing rod, my grandfather's dowsing rod. I ought to get that and show that to you. And he had located a nice galena body, silver lead. And so they started running that tunnel in, and that rock, it was, I think his name was Alvy Thorvaldson's sand and gravel pit, was just right off of our mine property. And this mine was up higher, and it was actually on their property, but we had the mineral rights on it, so we could mine in that mine. And it had been run in the past, and so all Dad had to do was cut through all of the overburden that's come in over the years with a bulldozer and clean it out with a backhoe, and finally got into solid ground. And that tunnel was only about 5 feet high, so Dad enlarged it and he made it a nice mine. But the problem was that it caved in. And it caved in and buried our mucking machine and an ore car, and they're still under the ground in there. I don't think anybody would invest the money to go in and dig them out because it's too dangerous. But I learned how to timber with the cap and posts. I learned how to do all the lagging work on the sides and the tops, and I really enjoyed mining. And this kind of reminds me of another story where Dad had a partner by the name of Burl. Now Burl Springer was his name. I truly believe he was a shapeshifter. He was the kindest guy. He was the funniest man. He could tell jokes that would just have me rolling on the ground, but I shouldn't be laughing because they were a little off color and I was too young to know those things. So I went for a hike up in the mountains and I come across this great big lake. And it wasn't a big lake, it was a pond, but it had tens of thousands of tadpoles in it. And I walked up to it and they went, and the whole pond came active, all these tadpoles. So I hiked back down and I told Burl about these tadpoles, and it was spring and there was snow on the ground. He said, I'd like to see that. And so he hiked up with me and went in. Well, we flushed up a fawn, and it went running up this deer trail. And we followed the deer trail up, and we could see in the snow right off of the deer trail the pattern where it was actually the imprints of a cougar that had bedded down there. And you could see the indentations of its hair in the snow. And it got up and it was clawing after that fawn when it went running by. So it was kicking up the snow and the mud. And I was a little bit nervous about continuing on up to that pond. And I couldn't believe it when Burl says, I tell you what, Dave, I'm going to go around the pond on this side and you stay on this trail and I'll meet you on the other side. Well, I thought that was the dumbest idea. You know, I was scared, but I was also kind of dumb. So I did what he told me to do. And I walked up that trail, and when I got up to the other side of the pond, I met with Burl, and he was coming up from where the cougars had run, and he was a long ways away from the pond. So he must have ran through there, I was thinking. How did he get so far ahead of me? And he came back and he says, there's two cougars, Davy, and they got the fawn and they're having a meal. We don't want to disturb them. So we went the direction he had come around the pond, but his footprints weren't in the snow. There were cougar tracks, but I couldn't tell where Burl, how could Burl come in? There was a steep slope on that side and he had to have come around, but the only footprints were of this cougar. And so we got down around almost to the point where we had separated in the beginning, and that's where these cougar tracks turned in to boot tracks. And I never said a word to him about that, but I had heard of shapeshifters and I thought, that's really strange. Well, about a week later, I was walking across the mine rails to go into the cabin, and I heard this noise up above the entrance to the mine tunnel, and there was a great big elk, and it was coming straight down the mountain towards me, right above that mine tunnel. And I barely had enough time to run in to the cabin and slam the door behind me, and no sooner had I shut that door than it comes opening up, scared me to death, and there was Burl. And he was all covered with leaves and branches and stuff. And I says, Burl, didn't you see that great big elk? And he just looked at me and he says, oh, that was me. Now, I know that a kid's imagination can get away from him, but this thing was barreling through the shrubbery, the bushes, the scrub oak, and knocking branches off. And I don't think Burl had any cause to come down that way if he was a man. But he sure did scare the bejeebers out of me. I got even with him though. There was one night I was terrified. I had to go to the bathroom, and we didn't have an outhouse. What we had was the mine dump. And we'd go and squat over the end of the dump, and we'd hold on to the mine rails, and we'd take care of our business. And as I was just getting settled in to take care of my business, I heard all of these big snaps of branches and trees and stuff. And I just pulled my pants up and I ran into the cabin and I jumped up in bed. And it just scared me so bad. And Burl's down there. He says, "What the heck's the matter, Dave?" And I said, "There's something out there, Burl. It was breaking branches." And so he got his flashlight and he went out. And just as he hit it with the flashlight, it went, moo. Well, it had me scared so bad. I didn't want to go outside anyway. And later on that night, I think I was probably 12 years old, and I had to go to the bathroom so bad, and I was asleep, and I had this dream that I went out and went to the bathroom, and next thing I knew, Burl was hitting me with his pillow, and he was so mad at me because I had wet the bed, and all that was running down on his bed. We had a bunk bed, and he was below me. So, you know, these are two good experiences. I mean, no kids nowadays, I think, can really enjoy that kind of roughness out there in the wilds.
Did your dad ever say anything, or your brothers ever say anything about him being a shapeshifter kind of guy, or did he have any? Where did he come from? Who was he? Was he Indian? Was he native? Was he?
No. As far as I know, he was a white man. And I never even dared mention it to my dad. So I never talked about it. You know, there's these people just like me that have experiences with Sasquatch, and you tell people about it, they're going to think you're crazy, you know, but then it happened to you, and you like to share the story, and
you don't know that people will believe you.
Yeah, then most of them don't. They just, you know, he's a storyteller. Well, yes, I am. I was up hunting up above the Syndicate mine, and I ran into a guy from Spring Lake. And we sat there and talked, and we hadn't seen a deer. And he says, "Well, I'm going to head down the mountain. I forgot my canteen and I'm thirsty." And I said, "Well, I can show you where you can get the best water that you'll ever drink. And it's just a quarter mile back in the Syndicate mine." And so he followed me, and all I had was about a half a book of matches. And so every once in a while, as we were shuffling our feet along the rails, I'd light a match and kind of orient as to where we were.
You'd been in there thousands of times, so you knew the area.
Yeah, I knew it. I could go back in there in the dark, but it still creeped me out. But there's a spot back in the mine just after you get to the water barrel where there's a great big boulder, and it's blocking the entrance to a drift that goes off to the left. And I'd say it's maybe a fifth of a mile, not very far. And as I was walking back in there, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about these indentations that were in the wall opposite of that big boulder. And I always thought that they were the devil, his footprints, because they were cloven right up on the wall of the mine. And in that short time it took us to walk back to the water barrel, I made up a story. Now, I had no experience as a storyteller up to that point, and after we quenched our thirst, I says, "I want to show you something. Let's go back here just a little bit farther." And we went back there. I struck a match, and he could see where to go, and then I stopped, and some of the muck had sloughed down, and there was a nice place where we could sit down. And I told him about how I was with my dad, and we were hiking up higher up in the mountains when I was about 12 years old. And we saw cloven hoof prints all over the ground. And my dad, he thought they were like mountain sheep or mountain goats. And he says, "I didn't know there were any in this range down here," but we continued to follow them. And I'll be darned if they didn't lead to this old shack. Looked like it was 100 years old. It was dilapidated. And I was really, really interested to go up on in there, open the door, and see what was inside. And Dad says, "Davy, you don't know that there isn't anybody in there, so you just hang back here." And so he walks up on the porch and he knocks on the door. I follow him, and we're waiting, and that door opens. ever so slowly. And there was this old man. He had a long white beard. His hair was all long and scraggly, and he had a buckskin shirt on. He had old jeans. And he says, "Well, hello there, young man. Hi, boy. It's been a long time since we have had company." And I was scared to death. But he says, "Come in, come in." And so my dad, he obliged, and he went in, and the old man says, "Go ahead and sit down anywhere." Well, the only place we could sit was on this bed that was on the floor. And it was just a whole bunch of pine boughs and such with a blanket over it. And so we sat down on that, and he started telling us about how he came to being up there. And he said that he and his partner were working a mine. Well, it was probably the Syndicate mine, and they were working this mine, and his partner, they were both Italian, and his name was, he introduced himself as Lepiota Morgani. And he says that his partner was getting hungry, and he says, "I'm going to go out and grab our lunch buckets, and I'll come back in, and we'll sit down here and eat them in the coolness of the drift. And you just go ahead and rest." And so Lepiota sat down and was waiting for his partner, when all of a sudden there was this huge explosion, and mine timbers, rocks, and lagging. They were shooting through the air, pelting his body, and he was buried in the rubble. And he woke up sometime later, and he dug himself out of all that rubble. He was kind of, bruised but not broken. And he found his miner's hat, and he struck the carbide lantern flint, and he had light. And he could see that the tunnel was all blasted. It was all caved in. And why would his partner do that to him? Why would his partner try to cave him in and be done with him? And so he noticed that there was a flicker of light on the lantern, and he saw that there was a fissure, an opening, a big crack in the back of the tunnel. And the wind was coming out of there, and he thought, well, this is the way I'm going to get out of here. And so he dug himself and picked and shoveled, and he worked himself back in there until he come to this great big cavern, and there was a stream flowing through the cavern, and he was so thirsty he dove into the water, which he had his miner's hat with lantern on it, and it doused the lantern, and he was there in the dark drinking the water. And he went to crawl out, and he put his hands on something that was hideously slimy, and he went, "Ooh, what was that?" And his curiosity got the best of him, and he reached back down, and he put his hands around what appeared to be a large toadstool or mushroom of some sort. Well, at this time he's telling us this, he gets out his smoking pipe, and he takes this little mushroom, and he breaks it up and stuffs it into his pipe, and he's smoking it. And I couldn't believe it, but he says that he had 90 sleeps in that cavern, and all he had to eat was those mushrooms. And they gave him this uncanny sight. He said he got sick as a dog. He thought he was going to die. But the whole cavern was illuminated with this greenish glow, and he could see where he was going. So he eventually found his way out of the cavern, got up there in the mountains when the sun was just peeking over the horizon behind him, and he walked down the mountain, and all he could think of was he just couldn't wait to see his wife. And he stepped up on the front porch, opened up the door to his cabin, walked inside the cabin, across the living room, opened up the door to the bedroom, and there's his wife and his partner wrapped in her arms. Well, something inside of him just made him so angry, and he didn't know what to do but run away. And so he turned around and he ran away, and he went to this tavern, and he told them that silver had been discovered in drift number 2 in a mine where they'd both worked. And he went up in the mountains and he started carving out this great big round boulder opposite of drift number 2. And he waited, and his partner and his wife were coming in and they were dreaming of silver riches, and they walked down drift number 2 and he shouted, "This is it, devil!" And he had made a pact with Satan that if he could get even, then he would sell his soul to the devil. And so he says, "This is it, devil!" And he broke the rocks that were holding that boulder in place, and he pushed and pushed, and it fell and rolled. And he put his feet against the wall opposite drift number 2, and he pushed until that boulder was wedged tightly in place. Well, it was at that point where my dad grabbed a hold of me in that old man's cabin. He pulled me up and out the door we ran. And I says, "I was enjoying the story, Dad. How come you had me get out of there so fast?" And he says, "Don't worry, son, you'll understand someday." Well, we got down the mountain and went into that mine, and every time we see a mine, we want to go and explore it. And we walked back in a ways, and there was this great big boulder that was blocking drift number 2, and Dad shined his carbide lantern, and I'll be darned if there weren't the cloven imprints where the devil had placed his hooves and pushed that boulder into place so many years before. And when I said that, I struck a match and I showed that guy that I had with me the imprints in the wall of the tunnel, and that big boulder, out of that tunnel he ran. No light. He found his way out there, and I thought it was kind of funny, so I walked out, and when I got outside, he was standing on the end of the dump. He had his pants off, and he was waving them like this, and he says, "You scared the pee right out of me." Well, about a week later, I told that story to some librarians that I knew. I was working for Salt Lake City Public Library Systems, and they says, "We want you to tell that story at Theater 138 this Halloween." And so they got me to tell the story, and I had never spoke in front of an audience before. And I had stage fright so bad, I just wanted to run away. And I thought the only way I can overcome this stage fright is focus all my fear into my story. Well, it was such a good story. One of the professional storytellers that was there came up to me after, and she says, "Dave, you need to go home and start writing more stories because you are going to be a professional storyteller." And I've been a storyteller with the Utah Storytelling Guild. I was one of those that organized and helped get the 501(c) documents, and I've been involved with storytelling for 35 years now, and I sure have enjoyed it. It's the only thing I've ever done I haven't retired from.